On 23 February 1945, Adolf Hitler sat alone in the bunker, listening to news from Ankara. The message was brief: Turkey had declared war, and the last illusion of neutrality was gone for Berlin. Hitler did not shout or rage, he simply closed his eyes, feeling the map of Europe shrink once more. For years, Ankara had balanced between empires, trading chrome to Germany, promising friendship to Britain. Now that balance collapsed, under Allied pressure and Soviet threat, leaving Axis leaders exposed. In Berlin, the significance was immediate. Turkey controlled the straits, and Hitler understood the noose tightening. Neutral nations had been silent witnesses to the war, watching borders burn and alliances bleed, waiting. When they finally chose sides, the words spoken in Axis capitals revealed fear more than anger. At last, Joseph Goebbels wrote that evening, calling Turkey treacherous yet predictable, a nation of merchants. Behind the rhetoric was panic. Every neutral defection narrowed escape routes and emboldened the Allies. In Rome, Mussolini heard similar news months earlier, as Italy watched neighbors shift loyalties and prepared excuses. Across Axis Europe, the pattern was clear. Neutrality was a countdown, not a shield, and time had expired. This story begins in those rooms of denial, where leaders blamed diplomats and destiny rather than themselves. As Turkey stepped across the line, the Axis heard a verdict, spoken without gunfire. The war was closing in, not just with armies but with choices. And the walls were listening. In Ankara, diplomats moved carefully, aware their decision echoed in Berlin and Moscow alike. Hitler's reaction was muted, a sign of exhaustion more than strategy. As fronts collapsed elsewhere that night, he knew Turkey meant Allied airfields, control of seas, and symbolic isolation. For the German public, the news was softened, framed as irrelevant and late, yet morale sank. Neutrality had once promised survival. Now it delivered judgment, quietly and irrevocably. As winter faded from Europe, Axis leaders sensed the circle closing, not with speeches but silence. Their allies were fewer, their excuses thinner, and the world less afraid. This was only the beginning of how words spoken in private betrayed collapse before the end. On 10 June 1943, Benito Mussolini stood at a balcony in Rome, staring at an empty square below. The crowds were gone, the banners faded, and the radio carried news from Madrid that Spain would lean away. Francisco Franco had promised friendship, sympathy, and silence, yet refused entry into the war again. For Mussolini, this was betrayal without bullets, a neighbor choosing distance when loyalty was demanded. Italy's position was already fragile. Allied bombers struck cities, and German patience wore thin. In private, Mussolini raged, calling Spain cowardly. Yet his voice lacked conviction and certainty. He knew Spain's neutrality denied Axis control of Gibraltar, sealing the Mediterranean's fate. German envoys pressed Madrid relentlessly, offering grain and weapons. But Franco calculated survival. When reports reached Rome, Mussolini muttered that history favored the cautious, not the brave. Behind closed doors, Italian ministers whispered, if Spain stayed neutral, others would follow. Portugal watched closely, Switzerland listened quietly, and Sweden counted profits and risks. Every neutral decision felt like a vote, cast against the Axis future. Mussolini sensed the ground shifting. Alliances were no longer ideological, but mathematical and cold. Spain's refusal echoed louder than a declaration of war ever could. In Berlin, Hitler dismissed Franco as weak, yet fumed privately over a lost opportunity. The Mediterranean became an Allied lake, not by conquest alone, but by diplomatic refusal. For Italian soldiers in North Africa, Spain's neutrality meant no relief, no flank, no hope. Mussolini's speeches grew shorter, his gestures forced, as reality pressed closer. He blamed Britain, Jews, and fate, but never his own gamble. Neutral nations had learned, Axis promises came late, and defeat arrived early. As Rome darkened under air raid sirens, Mussolini realized neutrality elsewhere meant isolation here. Spain had chosen survival, Italy had chosen pride, and history was unforgiving. The words spoken in Rome that summer were quieter, filled with resignation. Axis leaders were learning neutrality was not indecision. It was judgment rendered in advance. On 12 September 1944, Adolf Hitler received a report from Stockholm, deep inside the wolf's lair. Sweden would cut critical iron ore shipments, bowing to Allied pressure, and the message landed heavily. For years Sweden had been useful, officially neutral yet economically aligned, feeding German industry quietly. Now that pipeline weakened, and Hitler understood tanks and guns depended on Swedish steel. He paced the room slowly, accusing diplomats of softness and destiny of betrayal. In private he ranted that neutral nations profited from German blood, then fled at defeat. Yet Sweden's choice was calculated. The Red Army was advancing, and Berlin looked doomed. Swedish leaders feared Soviet proximity more than German anger. Survival outweighed ideology, every time. Goebbels noted bitterly, in his diary, that neutrality was merely delayed hostility. Factories in the Reich slowed, shortages worsened, and blame traveled downward. Hitler told aides Sweden had enjoyed protection, now choosing cowardice at the final hour. The truth was harsher, German power no longer guaranteed consequences. Fear had shifted sides. In Bern, Switzerland watched closely, guarding borders while banking secrets and refugees alike. Swiss leaders tightened neutrality, blocking transit, sensing Germany could not retaliate anymore. Axis commanders cursed Alpine passes denied, while Allied supply lines expanded elsewhere. Neutrality had become a weapon, wielded silently against a collapsing empire. German generals understood this clearly. Resources lost mattered more than symbolic allies. In Sweden, newspapers softened language, framing decisions as moral balance, not abandonment. Berlin saw through it, understanding economics spoke louder than editorials. Hitler's reaction was restrained, not from calm, but from exhaustion and inevitability. Every neutral shift felt like confirmation that the war's outcome was sealed. No speeches followed, no threats issued, only grim silence in command rooms. The Axis had lost not only battles, but leverage, credibility, and fear. When neutrality turned away, it was not dramatic, it was fatal. These decisions whispered the ending, long before surrender documents were signed. On 20 August 1944, Emperor Hirohito received a quiet briefing inside the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. Portugal had tightened restrictions, denying Axis shipping access, under Allied diplomatic pressure. For Japan this was distant yet symbolic. Neutrality collapsing even in far seas, beyond battlefields. Hirohito listened silently, hands folded, as advisors explained fuel routes narrowing further. Japan relied on fragile lines, stretching across oceans, vulnerable to submarines and diplomacy alike. Neutral ports once offered rest, repair, and shadowed trade. Now doors closed politely. Prime Minister Koiso spoke cautiously, blaming Western coercion, yet admitting strategic consequences. Within naval command rooms, officers understood the truth. Japan was being isolated systematically. Portugal's decision followed Spain's restraint, and Sweden's recalculation, forming a quiet pattern. Neutrality was no longer passive, it was alignment without declarations or banners. Japanese newspapers avoided the subject, focusing instead on valor and sacrifice, masking concern. Privately, generals complained that neutral nations enjoyed peace, while condemning Japan's survival struggle. Hirohito reportedly murmured that small nations feared great wars more than dishonor. In reality, Japan's influence had waned, and fear no longer compelled cooperation. Each neutral refusal tightened the Allied blockade, strangling resources without firing shots. Tokyo diplomats sent cables pleading for exceptions, invoking history and courtesy, receiving none. Fuel shortages worsened, aircraft grounded, fleets immobilized. Consequences measured in silence. Neutral decisions carried weight, Not in speeches, but in empty tanks and harbors. Japanese leadership debated destiny, some arguing endurance. Others sensing unavoidable collapse. Hirohito remained reserved, absorbing blame without outward protest. A monarch bound by tradition. He understood neutrality turning away meant Japan stood alone against the world. The war had shifted, from expansion to endurance, from conquest to survival. Every neutral nation choosing distance shortened Japan's horizon. No dramatic confrontation followed, just the steady closing of options. In quiet rooms across Tokyo, leaders realized isolation was the final battlefield. On 5 September 1944, Adolf Hitler sat with his generals. As news arrived from Sofia, Bulgaria had switched sides, abandoning neutrality's pretense and opening its doors to the Allies. Though formally Axis aligned, Bulgaria's shift echoed like a neutral betrayal, sudden and decisive. Hitler slammed his fist lightly. Not in rage, but disbelief. As maps were redrawn instantly. The Balkans unraveled, supply routes collapsed. And German divisions found themselves exposed. He accused Bulgarian leaders of opportunism, claiming they waited for weakness, then struck. In truth, Bulgaria feared Soviet armies advancing south and chose survival over loyalty. Berlin radio condemned the move, yet offered no real response. Power had drained away. Romania's earlier defection haunted the room, proving precedent mattered more than promises. Hitler muttered that small states had no honor, only instincts and fear. For German soldiers retreating through Yugoslavia, Bulgaria's decision closed roads and sealed fates. Neutrality once allowed maneuver, now betrayal accelerated collapse. Goebbels framed the news as treachery. Yet diaries revealed despair behind propaganda. The Eastern Front surged forward, unimpeded by former buffers and cautious allies. Soviet diplomats celebrated quietly, knowing diplomacy saved blood and time. Axis cohesion shattered, as nations recalculated, watching Berlin burn from afar. Hitler's authority remained absolute in words, hollow in effect. Every defection proved, German dominance was memory, not threat. In occupied capitals, resistance movements sensed momentum. Courage born from Axis weakness. Neutral neighbors adjusted borders and policies, preparing for post-war realities. Germany now fought alone, flanked by former friends turned obstacles. Hitler retreated into silence, issuing orders that reality ignored. The war's end approached, not with explosions alone, but with signatures and shifts. Bulgaria's choice demonstrated. Neutrality delayed nothing, it only timed survival. As autumn settled over Europe, Axis leaders felt abandonment more than defeat. On 23 October 1944, Emperor Hirohito reviewed reports. As Japan's diplomatic world shrank further, Ireland reaffirmed neutrality publicly, yet severed quiet channels that once favored Axis communication. To Tokyo, this signaled something deeper. Moral distance replacing silent tolerance across continents. Japanese diplomats in Europe warned. Even sympathetic neutrals now feared association with defeat. Hirohito listened calmly, though aides sensed tension. As strategic isolation intensified, neutrality once allowed ambiguity, now demanded visible separation from collapsing powers. Japan's foreign ministry protested politely, invoking sovereignty and precedent, receiving formal silence. In Berlin, similar reactions echoed. Axis leaders recognizing patterns beyond coincidence. Each neutral decision stripped legitimacy, leaving Japan branded aggressor without buffers. Military planners noted, ports unavailable meant longer routes, heavier losses, fewer options. Irish leaders cited principle, yet calculated post-war positioning carefully. Neutral nations planned for peace, not victory, and distanced themselves accordingly. Hirohito reportedly remarked that neutrality was courage disguised as restraint. In truth, Japan's leverage evaporated. Economic pressure replacing naval engagement. The Allies needed no threats. Neutral recalculations achieved similar results quietly. Tokyo newspapers framed events as Western hypocrisy, avoiding internal doubt. Privately, cabinet members argued. Isolation made endurance impossible, surrender inevitable. The emperor remained distant, weighing tradition, duty, and national survival. Neutral decisions echoed louder than battlefield losses, because they signaled consensus. Japan was no longer feared, only endured, until resolution arrived. Diplomatic cables grew shorter, replies colder, optimism absent. Isolation tightened slowly, like a net drawn without urgency. Hirohito understood, wars end when choices vanish, not when bullets stop. Every neutral nation stepping back shortened the distance to surrender. The silence surrounding Japan was louder than defeat announcements. On 8 March 1945, Heinrich Himmler sat in a dim office, reading cables from Bern. Switzerland had hardened its neutrality, freezing Axis assets, and blocking remaining intelligence channels. For Himmler, this was personal. Swiss banks once promised discretion, now doors closed firmly. He paced slowly, murmuring about betrayal, while knowing leverage was gone. Neutral Switzerland had survived by balance, but sensed Germany's defeat was inevitable. The decision was framed as legal caution, yet its meaning was unmistakable. German money trapped abroad meant fewer options, fewer escapes, fewer futures. Himmler blamed bankers and lawyers, ignoring the collapse he helped engineer. In Berlin, the news barely caused reaction. Shock had been exhausted already. Axis leaders no longer argued, they catalogued losses in silence. Swiss officials emphasized sovereignty, humanitarian duty, and post-war responsibility. Behind that language was fear of Allied judgment and Soviet proximity. Neutrality now required visible distance, not quiet accommodation. For SS officials seeking routes and refuge, Switzerland's stance ended illusions. Himmler privately considered separate peace ideas, desperation replacing ideology gradually. He understood neutrality turning firm meant no shadows remained to hide within. The Allies watched approvingly, knowing financial isolation hastened collapse. Each neutral clampdown shortened the war, without a single shell fired. German citizens never heard these details, propaganda shielded them briefly. Yet leadership felt it acutely, options erased line by line. Himmler's power felt vast on paper, meaningless in practice. Neutral nations now aligned with outcomes, not promises. Switzerland's choice echoed others, Spain, Sweden, Portugal, all stepping back. The Axis world contracted inward, until only ruins remained. In quiet rooms, leaders realized, neutrality had judged them unworthy of risk. On 12 April 1945, Benito Mussolini rode north, through rain-soaked roads near Lake Como. Sweden's final restrictions reached him that morning, cutting remaining diplomatic courtesies and transit hopes. Though distant, the news felt personal. Even neutral nations now closed doors completely. Mussolini understood this instinctively. Neutrality no longer tolerated fugitives from a losing cause. His voice shook as he told aides that Europe had already judged him. For years Sweden balanced trade and morality, now morality aligned with victory. Italian fascism had no refuge, no sympathetic silence left to exploit. Neutral embassies once offered listening ears, now returned messages unanswered. Mussolini's confidence had evaporated, replaced by calculations of escape and survival. The war's end approached not as spectacle, but as abandonment by the world. German support was collapsing, and neutral patience had expired. Swedish officials justified decisions as humanitarian clarity, distancing themselves from fascist ruin. Mussolini cursed this language, knowing it signaled irreversible moral consensus. Neutrality had evolved from flexibility into condemnation without words. As partisans closed in, Mussolini grasped that borders meant nothing anymore. No neutral flag would shield him, no diplomatic ambiguity remained. The Allies required no arrest warrants, neutrality enforced outcomes automatically. His earlier boasts rang hollow, echoes trapped in alpine valleys. Neutral nations chose the future, abandoning the past without apology. Mussolini's final conversations revealed bitterness, regret, and disbelief intertwined. He blamed betrayal everywhere, except within his own decisions. Europe had moved on, silently and efficiently. The collapse of neutrality's shelter meant no exits remained. By the time he reached the village, the world had already closed ranks. Neutral silence transformed into final judgment, irreversible and cold. On 24 April 1945, Adolf Hitler received his final foreign intelligence brief. Inside the Berlin bunker, the report stated that all remaining neutral governments had severed informal contact, completely and deliberately. Even those once sympathetic now avoided Berlin entirely, fearing association with collapse. Hitler read the pages slowly, his hand steady, his expression distant. There were no outbursts, no accusations left to spend, only a quiet recognition. Neutrality had finished its transition from cautious balance into silent condemnation. Spain stalled messages, Sweden ignored cables. Switzerland locked accounts permanently. For Hitler, this meant more than isolation, it meant history had already moved on. He remarked to aides that neutrality always served the strong, never the defeated. The words carried no anger, only resignation, sharpened by inevitability. Allies advanced from every direction, yet diplomatic silence felt heavier. Neutral nations now spoke through absence, through unanswered phones and closed borders. The bunker air felt thicker, as if the world above no longer existed. Hitler understood, no mediator would emerge, no last-minute leverage remained. The war would end without negotiation, only unconditional outcome. Neutrality once delayed consequences, now accelerated them decisively. Those governments prepared for post-war trials, rebuilding, and moral positioning. Berlin was excluded from all of it, already written out. Hitler's final orders focused inward, on loyalty, sacrifice, and myth. Externally, the Reich no longer mattered, not even as a threat. Neutral judgment had aligned fully with Allied victory. The silence surrounding Germany was complete, absolute, and deliberate. In that silence, Hitler sensed defeat was not coming, it had arrived. History had closed its doors, without ceremony or negotiation. Neutral nations had chosen the future, and left the Axis behind. On 6 July 1945, the surviving Axis world existed only in memory and ruins. In Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito listened to Allied declarations. As neutral nations re-entered diplomacy openly, those same governments, once cautious and silent, now spoke confidently of order and peace. Neutrality had completed its journey, from survival tactic into moral alignment with victory. Hirohito understood this clearly, as ambassadors returned only after surrender became certain. The words spoken by Axis leaders earlier now felt distant and naive. Promises of balance and leverage dissolved under the weight of outcomes. Neutral nations had not betrayed, they had calculated, and calculation had won. Across Europe, courts assembled, borders shifted, and histories were rewritten carefully. Former Axis leaders were absent, imprisoned, dead, or silent in disgrace. What they once said about neutrals now sounded like confession rather than accusation. They had relied on fear, not trust, and fear proved temporary. Neutral choices shaped the war's final months, without armies or offensives. Diplomacy replaced gunfire, and silence proved decisive. Hirohito addressed his people weeks later, acknowledging endurance, without naming isolation directly. Yet everyone understood, Japan had stood alone long before surrender was announced. Neutral nations gathered influence because they waited, watched, and chose the winning future. Axis leaders had spoken of honor, strength, and destiny, ignoring consequences. Their reactions to neutrality revealed truth: power fades faster than belief. What was said in bunkers and palaces exposed collapse before defeat. History remembers battles vividly, but these moments mattered just as much. When neutrality turned away, the war's verdict was already sealed. No speech could reverse that, no threat could delay it. The Axis fell, not only by force, but by abandonment. And in that abandonment, the world chose its next chapter, deliberately and coldly.